Hi everyone, I'm Afrah, and we're going to have a debrief on the motion "This House prefers leaderless social movements." So the way I'm going to structure this debrief is first discuss broad social movements debates and how to approach that, and then go into the specifics of the motion. So first, in terms of broad social movements debates, I think the first thing to keep in mind is different goals that movements might have, and this is important because I think most debates regarding social movements are one of two things. Either both sides agree on the same goal and they're trying different ways to achieve or get to that same goal, or it's that both sides are going to have different goals. And at the end of the debate, what's more important is not how you achieve that goal, because that's probably something that both teams are able to mechanize, but which of these two needs to be prioritized in the debate or is more important for the social movement to prioritize. So in that case, you need to weigh which of the goals are important. So given that most debates, at least in my conceptualization of social movement debates, is one of these two things, there are a few goals to keep in mind that like broadly applies to most of these debates. I think the first thing is in terms of gaining support for the movement. And when it comes to support, it's not only just numbers and in terms of the number of people you're able to gather and get the critical mass for the movement to function, but it's also the kinds of supports that you might have. So this can range from like moderate supporters who are either somewhat they care about the cause to some extent, but they're not as passionate as like diehard supporters of the movement might be. So debates are mostly across like whether you want more moderate supporters or whether you want to sustain the movement by like catering towards the most important stakeholder or like the most important followers who are people who have been there for a long period of time and would support the movement regardless of what it is. I think another goal to keep in mind is in terms of outreach and awareness. And the impact that stems from that is if you get more outreach and awareness, presumably that will lead to more support, but it might also lead to more funding for the movement. Another kind of goal is to keep like the founding principles of the movement in mind, and in terms of whether you need to stick to that or changing that and how that would impact the debate. And finally, is in terms of legislative change and reform. But this is also based on like all of these things are somewhat interlinked and interconnected. But I think these are like some goals to keep in mind when it comes to social movements debates. And it's either that both sides agree on it or disagree on it, where the debate diverges. I think another thing to keep in mind is how to approach these debates. It's usually either based on stakeholders in terms of like the kind of support, like I spoke about before, but it's also based on like the timeline or implementation of the motion, which I think is true of this motion. So I'll get to the example directly so it makes more sense. In the motion, this House prefers leaderless social movements. On proposition, firstly, you need to identify what kind of goals the social movement wants to achieve. So in this case, you can go with like support for the movement, reform for the movement, and like the kinds of support and all of those things. But in addition to that, another way to segment the debate is based on the timeline. So whether you're able to have a leader in the very first place is one question that needs to be answered in this debate in terms of whether like your attempt to even establish a leadership will be successful. And another part to victory will be even if this is successful and we assume all of that, whether this is actually good for the movement. I think opposition is going to come after both of these things actually. But I'll get to the opposition paths to victory in a minute. But in terms of proposition, these are two ways that you can establish the paths to victory for this debate. But obviously, you can also do the general thing of more support, more reform, more awareness, more funding, all of those things as well. But this is one way to approach the paths to victory. I think the paths to victory on opposition is another example of how to approach social movements debates. I think on opposition, what you can do is instead of going with the paths to victory established by proposition, although you can do the same thing and run with that, another way to do that might be based on the structure of the movement itself, i.e., whether the internal structure of social movements is going to remain intact without a leader. And the second is whether external support or like the external factors affecting the movement are going to help the movement, i.e., whether you can get more support. So there is an internal, external kind of divide that you can use for opposition in terms of paths to victory. So these are different ways to approach paths to victory in this kind of debates. Given that, I think I'll just go into the proposition case now. In terms of proposition, I think there are a couple of things that you can argue about. The first thing is, like I established, I'll just go with the paths to victory. The first is on whether you can establish a movement or like a leader in the very first place for the movement. And here, I think there are a few things that you can discuss. The first thing we can discuss is how social movements are originated. These are often things that where you go against structures that have already been established, i.e. the government, because you think the government is not representing you enough. So in this regard, the question is whether people would actually appreciate having a leader within the social movement in the very first place, and like whether people have in modern society, do they value structures and like the idea of having a structure in the very first place? I think the second thing you can say is also whether you can actually find one leader that can represent the movement, or how many leaders that you're going to have. And all of these questions needs to be answered by opposition in this debate as well. But in the event that you do have a leader, there are so many things that comes with it, i.e. the leader is going to be the face of the movement. So everything that they do is probably going to be associated with the movement, and whether this is a good thing in the very first place. The second most fundamental question is whether you are able to find one or like some people who can represent the movement, and whether everyone in the social movement is going to be happy with it, because like lived experiences are diversified between different groups, and the question is whether people would appreciate having one leader representing their lived experience. And in this regard, you can bring like context regarding partisanship, how people are divided upon based on like several opinions, and there are so many different viewpoints of people, lived experiences of people, how they relate to the movement is also different from person to person. So the ability to form that in the very first place is going to be hard. So obviously, I'm not going to get into the mechanization of this, although there is more that you can run here. But this is one way or one argument that you can run on proposition. Another argument that you can run on proposition is assuming that you can establish and have a leader in the very first place, whether it's going to benefit the movement, i.e., if you do not have a leader, it's probably better for the movement because you're able to like gather people from different backgrounds instead of boxing the amount kind of people that enter the movement. Because although you pick someone, they might not be relatable to everyone. For example, if they are from the upper class, maybe the low class people don't relate to the movement anymore because they think that this is only a movement for the upper class. So there are different factors that affect the support for the movement. Support for the movement as well. You can also kind of talk about the sustainability of the movement, i.e., whether having a leader is probably a bad thing because it means that governments can just shoot them and kill them, or like they can delegitimize these leaders by like social media activism, for instance, and governments propaganda being released in public, or they can be like held paid off, for example. So these are different things that governments can do in an instance where you do have a face for the movement. It's easier for them to target them and assassinate them if necessary. So these are two potential paths to victory that you can run on proposition. Although I want to keep in mind that the first thing or the first path to victory that we established in terms of like whether you can have a leader and like establish a leadership in the very first place might not be a positive path to victory, but it is important in the debate because if opposition brings that up, your case becomes significantly weaker because that is the prerequisite to any impact that we're claiming. So although it doesn't on face value look like a path to victory that needs to be or like is going to win us the debate, it is a necessary path to victory that needs to be there for us to run any arguments after that. So a good opposition would probably start with this because this just delegitimizes the entire proposition case. If they can't run the first part to victory, they can't have the benefits that they want from the second part to victory. Okay, in terms of the opposition case, I think there are a couple arguments that you can run again. The first is in terms of whether you're able to get support for the movement in the very first place. So here you can break down the stakeholders like we discussed before in terms of like people who just watch a video and like come and support or like give like $1 to the movement. There are moderate supporters who might attend a few protests, and then there are like people who are consistently present in the movement, i.e. people who go to all protests, go to all meetings, engage with the movement fully, and care about the cause significantly. So based on these margins, I think you can discuss in terms of whether a leader will be beneficial or not. A few impacts that you can run with having a leader is firstly is the mobilization of resources, but it's also the mobilization of things like the organizational level of the movement itself becomes much cleaner because you know who to approach, you know who to hold accountable when it comes to like when things go wrong in the social movement as well. And they're able, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute in terms of the support. But within the movement itself, the internal structure becomes much cleaner, which means people think that the movement is legit and they can also hold someone accountable when something goes wrong instead of like having to not having an accountability structure in the very first place. I think the second thing you can talk about is in terms of the externals, i.e., in terms of the support that you get, in terms of the amount of funding that you get. I think the first thing you can talk about is the loyalty, but also the kind of supporters that are going to enter the movement. Like anyone who likes that person is going to enter that movement, presumably, and going to donate some funds. They're probably popular, which means that you can also get media attention as a result of this. Like TV shows want to host these people on their channels because it means that they get popularity as well. I think the third thing you can say is also governments probably are more willing to support the movement because they know there is some level of accountability and someone to hold accountable when things go wrong. So these are a few things that you can run on opposition as impacts. But I think the fundamental thing to winning social movements debates is identifying how to win the debate, i.e., the paths to victory that you have on both sides. Because if you figure that out, the impacts are often much easier to come up with than at the paths to victory itself. Um, yeah, so I think everything else is just mechanization of how to mechanize each of these things. But you can also talk about cross-movement collaboration in terms of like, if you have a leader, then you can like, the leaders can like talk to other social movements and work together in terms of fighting government structures, for instance. But these are just like random argument ideas that you can run, mechanization that you can run. So that is the debrief. I hope that was helpful, and thank you.